At exactly 10:47 a.m., Hillary Clinton tried to end the conversation with a joke and instead exposed the one weakness that no amount of experience can permanently hide. She called Kash Patel a political mascot, wearing a badge, assuming the room would reward the line with knowing laughter and instant closure. Patel didn't raise his voice or rush to defend himself because people who understand power know that urgency is often a confession of insecurity. If that opening feels unusually sharp, it's because it is meant to be. Not to entertain outrage, but to force attention before the audience scrolls away. And if you're already asking why this critique sounds so unforgiving, stay with the video to the end, because the reason has less to do with personalities and more to do with how authority survives scrutiny. My position is not hidden, and it is not neutral, but it is also not tribal, which is why it tends to irritate everyone equally. Hillary Clinton represents a generation of American leadership trained to believe that institutional longevity is proof of moral reliability. Kash Patel represents a counter-instinct that insists longevity without accountability is not experience. It is insulation. The real conflict here is not left versus right, or old guard versus newcomer, but whether power should be trusted by default or earned repeatedly. That distinction matters, because a democracy collapses not when people disagree, but when they stop believing that disagreement can produce truth. The hearing room itself tells part of the story before anyone speaks, because Washington stages seriousness like theater. Marble walls, flags placed with geometric precision, cameras arranged to capture every angle that can later be clipped and weaponized online. Clinton enters with the posture of someone who has survived decades of investigations and expects survival to be mistaken for vindication. Patel is already seated, signaling that this is not about dominance rituals, but about who controls the framing once the questions start. From the first glance, the dynamic is clear. One side expects deference, the other expects resistance. Clinton opens with language that is sharp but familiar, accusing Patel of politicizing law enforcement and serving partisan vendettas. It is a sophisticated attack because it does not require proof, only emotional recognition from an audience conditioned to fear institutional misuse. Patel listens without interruption, understanding that letting an accusation breathe often weakens it more than rebuttal ever could. When he responds, he does not counterattack, but reframes the purpose of oversight itself as consistency rather than performance. That move is subtle because consistency is the one standard that makes power uncomfortable across every political identity. He reminds the room that institutions do not gain legitimacy from history alone, but from the perception that rules apply even when it is inconvenient. Clinton reacts with visible irritation because irritation often appears when someone hears a critique that cannot be easily dismissed as bad faith. She references prior reviews and closed matters, signaling that procedure should function as an emotional sedative for the public. Patel answers that closure without clarity is not resolution, it is postponement, and postponement breeds suspicion rather than trust. This is where the audience begins to lean in, because suspicion is a language they already speak fluently. At this point, the clash becomes philosophical rather than procedural, which is far more dangerous for reputations. Clinton argues that experience creates context, and context demands discretion, especially in matters of national security. Patel agrees that discretion matters, but warns that discretion becomes indistinguishable from concealment when explanations are permanently deferred. The exchange lands because it exposes a fear both sides share but rarely admit, that transparency can destabilize, but secrecy can rot. Neither option is comfortable, which is why politicians often pretend the choice does not exist. Patel introduces a controlled note of humor, careful not to demean or insult identity, because he knows the audience punishes cruelty faster than dishonesty. He remarks that Washington audits money faster than it audits memory, and the room responds with uneasy laughter. Clinton does not laugh because humor strips armor by making power look human rather than monumental. In politics, being human is risky because humans can be questioned, while icons are only defended or destroyed. That moment matters more than any document because it signals a shift in emotional authority. Here is the first question that quietly destabilizes the room and ignites comment sections later. If a mid-level government employee handled sensitive judgment the same way senior officials have, would the system call it a mistake or a violation? The question is not an accusation, but a mirror, and mirrors make people uncomfortable when they cannot control the angle. Clinton responds with language about unique pressures of high office, implicitly arguing that responsibility justifies exception. Patel responds that responsibility without equal exposure transforms leadership into hierarchy, not service. As the exchange continues, it becomes clear that the audience is no longer choosing between two people, but between two instincts. One instinct values stability so deeply that it tolerates opacity as a necessary cost. The other instinct values accountability so deeply that it risks turning oversight into spectacle. The tension between those instincts is the real subject of this confrontation, not any single controversy. And that is why this opening matters, because it frames the debate not as scandal hunting, but as a test of democratic endurance. So if you're wondering again why this critique sounds unusually direct, the answer is simple. Soft language protects comfort, not truth, and comfort is not what the public lacks right now. The question is not whether Clinton is uniquely flawed or Patel is uniquely virtuous, because neither claim survives serious scrutiny. The question is whether Americans still believe that power should explain itself, or whether explanation is now optional for the experienced and connected. Stay with the video, because this question only gets harder, and the answers only get more revealing. As the room settles after the opening exchange, the tone subtly shifts from theatrical tension to something more dangerous, which is sustained attention. Clinton realizes quickly that this is not going to be a short skirmish resolved by authority or seniority, because Kash Patel is not chasing a viral moment. He is constructing a frame. That frame is built around one simple premise. Trust is not inherited, it is renewed, and renewal requires friction. She adjusts her posture and narrows the discussion, trying to pull it back toward familiar ground where process language usually wins. But the audience has already sensed that process alone is no longer the currency being traded. Clinton emphasizes precedent, pointing out that administrations across parties have relied on internal review mechanisms for decades. She speaks with the confidence of someone who believes continuity itself is evidence of legitimacy. Patel responds by saying continuity can also be evidence of unexamined habit, and habit is where accountability quietly goes to sleep. He is careful not to accuse her of intentional wrongdoing, because intention is the refuge of people avoiding responsibility. Instead, he questions whether the structure itself incentivizes insulation over explanation. The exchange grows sharper without growing louder, which is why it feels heavier to viewers paying attention. Clinton frames Patel's approach as corrosive to morale, arguing that constant suspicion discourages capable people from public service. Patel counters that public service is not a reward for comfort, but an obligation that requires exposure to scrutiny. He says morale built on immunity is fragile because it collapses the moment protection disappears. That line matters because it reframes discomfort as a feature of ethical leadership, not a flaw. Clinton then introduces a familiar but powerful defense, warning that excessive transparency risks harming national security and diplomatic relationships. She argues that some decisions must remain opaque to protect allies and operational integrity. Patel agrees in principle, but then draws a critical distinction that changes the meaning of her argument. He says secrecy that protects the nation is legitimate, but secrecy that protects reputations is corrosive, and the public can sense the difference. The danger, he adds, is that Washington often uses the same language to describe both. At this moment, the conversation stops being about a single hearing and starts reflecting a broader collapse in institutional credibility. Patel points out that the phrase "trust the process" has lost persuasive power because the outcomes rarely feel proportional. Clinton responds that proportionality is subjective, and governance cannot bend to every perception. Patel replies that perception is not noise, it is feedback, and ignoring feedback is how systems fail quietly before they fail publicly. The room grows still because feedback is a word institutions claim to value but rarely tolerate. Clinton accuses Patel of fueling populist anger, suggesting that his framing legitimizes resentment rather than reason. Patel answers that resentment grows when citizens feel dismissed, not when they feel heard. He says the public is not angry because leaders are imperfect, but because leaders appear untouchable. That distinction lands hard, because untouchability is the one accusation no democratic institution can afford to accept. Clinton pushes back by saying no one is untouchable, pointing to investigations and reviews as proof. Patel does not deny the existence of investigations, but questions their psychological impact on public confidence. He asks whether investigations that end without visible consequence restore trust or reinforce suspicion. Clinton says legal standards must govern outcomes, not public emotion. Patel agrees, but adds that legal sufficiency does not automatically produce moral credibility. The gap between those two concepts is where faith in governance quietly erodes. The exchange begins to reveal a deeper philosophical divide that neither side fully controls anymore. Clinton represents a worldview where stability is preserved through managed disclosure and controlled accountability. Patel represents a worldview where legitimacy is preserved through visible confrontation with uncomfortable questions. Neither worldview is entirely safe, and that is precisely why the confrontation matters. The public is watching not to see who wins, but to see which worldview acknowledges their lived skepticism. Clinton warns again that constant interrogation risks turning governance into permanent crisis mode. Patel responds that crisis mode already exists, and pretending otherwise is what allows it to metastasize. He says people no longer believe reassurances delivered after decisions are finalized. They want to see deliberation, uncertainty, and admission of risk, while choices are still being made. That demand is new, and it terrifies institutions built on finality rather than dialogue. As Part 2 closes, the tension has clearly escalated, but not toward chaos, toward clarity. The audience now understands that this confrontation is not about vindication or humiliation. It is about whether power still feels answerable in real time, rather than retrospectively excused. Clinton senses that the ground has shifted beneath her arguments, even if her authority remains intact. And Patel knows that once the question of equal accountability is spoken out loud, it cannot be unheard. By the time the exchange reaches its third phase, the hearing no longer feels like a procedural inquiry and more like a stress test on political culture itself. What began as a question of oversight has now widened into a confrontation over what the public is allowed to expect from those who govern them. Clinton understands this shift immediately because she has lived through multiple eras where the rules of engagement quietly changed midstream. Patel understands it too, but from the opposite direction, because his relevance is tied to exposing precisely those unspoken rule changes. Neither of them says this out loud, but the audience can feel it in the pacing and the pauses. Clinton pivots toward the language of responsibility, not personal responsibility, but institutional responsibility, which is far more abstract and harder to challenge. She argues that leadership requires filtering information, not because citizens are incapable, but because chaos thrives on partial understanding. Patel listens carefully because this argument has emotional appeal, especially to people who fear instability more than injustice. When he responds, he does not deny the danger of chaos, but reframes the source of it. He says chaos does not emerge from information. It emerges from the suspicion that information is being managed for convenience. That reframing matters because it shifts blame away from citizens and back onto leadership behavior. Clinton counters by warning that constant skepticism erodes confidence in democratic systems. Patel answers that blind confidence erodes them faster because it turns citizenship into spectatorship. He says people are not withdrawing from civic life because they ask too many questions, but because answers feel performative rather than sincere. This is the moment where the discussion quietly crosses from politics into psychology. Clinton challenges Patel directly, asking whether he trusts institutions at all. It is a strategic move, because questioning trust can make a critic appear destabilizing. Patel responds that trust is not a binary state. It is a relationship, and relationships require ongoing honesty. He says institutions that demand trust without explanation are not asking for loyalty, they are asking for submission. That word hangs in the air, because submission is the opposite of democratic consent. The audience reaction is subtle but telling. Fewer murmurs, more stillness, because people are processing rather than reacting. Clinton insists that Patel's framing risks delegitimizing decades of governance and public service. Patel replies that legitimacy does not disappear because it is questioned. It disappears when questions are treated as threats. He emphasizes that accountability does not weaken institutions, it clarifies them. Clarity, he argues, is the only antidote to the conspiracy culture that both sides publicly condemn but privately exploit. Clinton then deploys one of her most effective rhetorical shields: experience. She speaks about crisis decision-making, compressed timelines, and the burden of consequences that critics never carry. Patel acknowledges that burden, but draws a line between difficulty and exemption. He says, experience should deepen humility, not entrench defensiveness. The more power one has held, the more responsibility one bears to explain its use. At this point, the hearing reveals an uncomfortable symmetry. Clinton fears that exposing too much will unravel the fabric holding institutions together. Patel fears that exposing too little has already begun that unraveling. Both fears are rational, and both are grounded in recent history. The tragedy is that the system has trained leaders to choose fear management over trust building. Patel asks a question that is deceptively simple and therefore difficult to escape. If the public cannot see how decisions are made, how can it distinguish error from abuse? Clinton responds that mechanisms exist, but they operate out of public view for good reason. Patel replies that invisible mechanisms cannot repair visible distrust. Trust, he says, is not restored by assurances. It is restored by exposure to process. The tension tightens as Clinton accuses Patel of encouraging suspicion toward public servants. Patel responds that suspicion is already widespread, and denial only validates it. He says the choice is not between trust and suspicion, but between unmanaged suspicion and informed skepticism. Informed skepticism, he argues, is a sign of a healthy democracy, not a failing one. This distinction reframes criticism as participation rather than hostility. As Part 3 draws to a close, the confrontation has clearly moved beyond personalities. What the audience is witnessing is a collision between two definitions of leadership legitimacy. One definition prioritizes continuity, discretion, and institutional memory. The other prioritizes transparency, consistency, and visible accountability. Neither side has won, but the fault line has been fully exposed, and once exposed, it cannot be quietly sealed again. By the fourth phase of the hearing, something irreversible has happened, even though no single sentence can be isolated as the cause. The discussion has crossed the invisible boundary where viewers stop asking who is right and start asking why the system feels so brittle. Clinton senses that shift because she has spent her career reading rooms as carefully as briefing papers. Patel senses it too, and he slows his pace, understanding that acceleration now would look like exploitation rather than inquiry. The room is quieter, not calmer, but heavier, as if everyone understands that what is being examined can no longer be contained by talking points. Clinton reframes her defense once again, this time leaning on the concept of democratic resilience. She argues that institutions survive precisely because they are insulated from constant pressure and emotional volatility. In her view, restraint is not avoidance, it is stewardship, and stewardship requires leaders to resist the demand for perpetual explanation. Patel does not reject the idea of stewardship, but he challenges its application in modern political culture. He says stewardship without transparency feels indistinguishable from guardianship without consent, and consent is democracy's only renewable resource. That distinction changes the emotional temperature of the room, because consent is a word Americans instinctively understand. Clinton responds that consent is exercised through elections, laws, and representative authority, not through continuous public interrogation. Patel answers that elections grant authority, but they do not grant immunity, and authority without ongoing accountability decays into entitlement. He emphasizes that the public is not asking to govern directly, but to be treated as adults capable of understanding complexity. When leaders decide complexity is too dangerous to share, citizens assume danger is being hidden, not complexity. Clinton warns that this expectation is unrealistic, that governance requires trust, precisely because not everything can be explained in real time. Patel agrees that real-time explanation has limits, but he says explanation delayed indefinitely becomes indistinguishable from evasion. He notes that many controversies only receive clarity once political risk has passed, which teaches the public a damaging lesson. That lesson is that truth is negotiable, but timing is strategic. Once that lesson is learned, cynicism becomes rational rather than corrosive. The chair attempts to steer the hearing back toward narrower questions, sensing the conversation drifting into uncomfortable territory. But narrowing now would feel artificial because the core issue has already surfaced and refuses to retreat. Patel resists the pivot gently, not by defying the chair, but by anchoring his next question in the broader theme of legitimacy. He asks whether Clinton believes public officials have a moral obligation to exceed minimum legal standards when trust is fragile. The question is dangerous because moral obligation cannot be outsourced to procedure. Clinton answers carefully, saying leaders must balance idealism with realism, and that perfectionism can paralyze governance. Patel replies that the public is not demanding perfection, but proportionality and candor. He says candor does not require self-destruction, only the courage to admit when judgment fell short. Clinton counters that admissions are weaponized in modern politics, turning humility into liability. Patel agrees, and adds that this weaponization exists precisely because honesty has become rare enough to be exploitable. The exchange reveals an uncomfortable feedback loop that neither side created alone. Leaders avoid admissions because admissions are punished. The public punishes admissions because it has been trained to distrust leaders who rarely admit anything. Both behaviors reinforce each other until the space for genuine accountability collapses. The hearing, at this point, feels less like an argument and more like an autopsy of that loop. Patel introduces a thought that lands quietly but resonates deeply with viewers paying close attention. He says institutions no longer suffer primarily from corruption, but from credibility fatigue. People are tired of being asked to believe without being shown, to accept without understanding. Clinton responds that fatigue is not a governing principle, and Patel agrees, but notes that it is a governing reality. Ignoring reality, he says, does not preserve institutions, it isolates them. As Part 4 closes, the confrontation has reached a point of mutual recognition, though not mutual agreement. Both Clinton and Patel understand that the old language of trust is no longer sufficient on its own. What they disagree on is whether adapting to this new environment requires tighter control or wider exposure. The audience is left with the unsettling realization that stability and transparency now feel like competing values rather than complementary ones. And once a democracy starts choosing between those values instead of balancing them, every decision becomes heavier than the last. By the time the exchange reaches its fifth movement, the confrontation no longer feels like a clash of personalities, but a stress test of political philosophy under live observation. The earlier sharpness has given way to something more unsettling, a slow exposure of assumptions that usually remain hidden beneath slogans and legal language. Both sides realize that no decisive blow is coming, and that in many ways, that is the most dangerous outcome of all. What remains is not victory or defeat, but the residue of unresolved tension that follows the audience home. This is where debates linger longest, not in what was said, but in what could not be cleanly answered. Kash Patel reframes his posture, moving away from pointed questioning and toward systemic observation. He argues that modern political accountability is no longer judged solely by outcomes, but by the perceived sincerity of process. In his view, the public is less interested in whether leaders always succeed, and more interested in whether failure is acknowledged honestly. He suggests that credibility is now built in moments of vulnerability rather than moments of triumph. That claim unsettles traditional political instincts, because vulnerability has rarely been rewarded in electoral politics. Hillary Clinton responds with a defense rooted in institutional memory rather than personal justification. She contends that politics is not a confessional space, but a decision-making arena constrained by risk, timing, and incomplete information. From her perspective, the demand for constant moral exposition misunderstands how power functions at scale. She implies that transparency without context can distort reality just as easily as secrecy can. The challenge, she argues, is not choosing openness over restraint, but deciding which form of restraint preserves stability. Patel presses on the psychological consequences of that restraint. He points out that when explanations arrive only after controversy fades, they feel curated rather than clarifying. The delay itself becomes suspicious, regardless of the explanation's substance. He notes that this pattern trains the public to assume that truth is released strategically, not responsibly. Once that assumption hardens, Even genuine disclosures are met with disbelief. Clinton does not deny the existence of that skepticism, but she questions whether governance can realistically function under its weight. She warns that leaders operating in perpetual anticipation of mistrust become reactive instead of deliberate. In that environment, policy decisions shift from long-term outcomes to short-term reputational defense. She suggests that this erosion of strategic patience is itself a threat to democratic resilience. The paradox, she implies, is that excessive transparency demands can undermine the very institutions they aim to protect. What makes this phase compelling is that neither argument collapses under scrutiny. Both positions contain internal logic, and both expose real vulnerabilities in the current political ecosystem. Patel's emphasis on credibility resonates with audiences shaped by years of institutional disappointment. Clinton's emphasis on structural constraints resonates with anyone who understands the complexity of governance. The tension is not between truth and deception, but between two competing models of responsibility. A moment of unintended levity breaks the intensity when Patel remarks, half dryly, that political survival skills now resemble crisis communications more than leadership. A few scattered laughs ripple through the room, not because the comment is humorous, but because it feels uncomfortably accurate. Clinton responds with a brief, knowing smile, acknowledging the observation without endorsing it. The exchange humanizes both figures for a fleeting second, reminding viewers that even seasoned actors recognize the absurdities of the system they inhabit. That brief pause makes the surrounding seriousness feel sharper rather than softer. As the segment winds down, Patel introduces a question that is less accusatory than reflective. He asks whether modern democracy has reached a point where trust must be rebuilt from the bottom up, rather than preserved from the top down. Clinton does not answer directly, instead cautioning that bottom-up trust without institutional coherence can fracture into competing realities. Patel replies that institutional coherence without trust becomes mere coordination, not legitimacy. Neither yields ground, and neither appears satisfied. Part 5 ends without resolution, but with a quiet realization taking hold among viewers. The debate is no longer about who misstepped, but about whether the political framework itself is equipped for an era defined by skepticism. If trust can no longer be assumed, only earned continuously, then leadership demands may be changing faster than institutions can adapt. That possibility is more destabilizing than any single allegation or defense raised during the hearing. And as the cameras pull back, the unanswered question hangs in the air, not about guilt or innocence, but about whether modern politics still knows how to speak to a public that no longer listens by default. The final movement of the confrontation does not arrive with a dramatic crescendo, but with something far more unsettling: quiet recognition. The room has heard enough arguments to understand that no single exchange will settle what has been building for years. Instead of tension escalating, it settles into a dense stillness, the kind that follows when people realize they are witnessing a structural problem rather than a personal clash. This is where the debate stops being about two individuals and starts reflecting the condition of the system itself. For the audience, the discomfort now comes not from shock, but from clarity. Kash Patel closes his line of reasoning by shifting away from institutional critique and toward civic consequence. He argues that when trust erodes long enough, citizens stop distinguishing between incompetence and malice, and that distinction is vital for democratic survival. In his view, a public that assumes bad faith everywhere becomes impossible to govern without coercion or spectacle. He warns that this is how democracies quietly hollow out, not through coups, but through exhaustion. His tone is no longer prosecutorial, but cautionary. Hillary Clinton answers with a reflection that feels less like defense and more like legacy management. She suggests that political life is often judged with the benefit of hindsight stripped of its original constraints. Decisions made under pressure are later evaluated as if all variables had been clear from the start. She does not ask for absolution, but for intellectual honesty about how power actually operates in real time. Her implication is subtle. Moral certainty is easiest when responsibility has already passed. What emerges in this final exchange is not reconciliation, but mutual acknowledgement of a deeper dilemma. Patel recognizes that relentless exposure without reform risks turning accountability into performance. Clinton recognizes that institutional authority without renewed trust risks becoming symbolic rather than functional. Neither disputes the other's premise outright, which may be the most telling development of all. The conflict resolves not through agreement, but through shared unease. A final, almost offhand moment lands with unexpected weight. Patel remarks that future leaders may be judged less by what they accomplish and more by what they are willing to explain. Clinton replies that explanation without responsibility is noise, but responsibility without explanation is silence. The exchange draws a murmur from the room, not applause, not protest, but recognition. It is the sound of an audience realizing the problem has no clean answer. As the hearing concludes and cameras begin to power down, the real question shifts away from the table. It moves toward the public watching from home, absorbing fragments through clips, headlines, and commentary. If every institution is distrusted and every explanation suspected, what standard remains for judgment? Can democratic accountability survive in an environment where belief itself has become partisan? Or does the future demand a new political language that neither side has fully learned to speak yet? The confrontation ends without a verdict, without a symbolic win, and without the satisfaction of closure. What it leaves behind is heavier than accusation or defense. A challenge to the audience itself. If leaders are reflections of the system that elevates them, then scrutiny cannot stop at personalities. It must extend to the expectations, incentives, and narratives that shape political behavior over decades. And that final, unresolved tension lingers long after the last frame fades, asking not who was right, but whether the system can still correct itself before trust disappears entirely.